From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good evening, and welcome to the Library of Congress and to Scholarfest, the 15th anniversary celebration of the John W. Kluge Center. A special word of appreciation to the members of Congress, members of the Diplomatic Corps, and distinguished guests who are here with us tonight. And I'm delighted to welcome back so many of our Kluge Center alumni who have come from near and far to be part of this first ever Scholarfest. I am welcoming you in the name of Dr. James Billington, the 13th Librarian of Congress. As I suspect most of you have heard, Dr. Billington announced his retirement today after 28 extraordinary years at the helm of this institution. He hopes to join us for dinner, but is presently tied up in meetings with congressional well-wishers and other senior administrative officials. We are extraordinarily pleased to be commemorating the 15th anniversary of the John W. Kluge Center and 15 years of scholarship at the Library of Congress that the center has fostered. This scholarly productivity is the legacy of John W. Kluge, a businessman, philanthropist, and a dear friend of this institution. We are delighted that his son, John Kluge Jr., could be with us this evening, as is his spirit. John Kluge Jr. Thank you. John Kluge donated an unprecedented $60 million to establish a center that would invite the world's leading thinkers to spend time in residence at the Library of Congress. These research residencies would allow scholars to make greater and more consequential use of the world's greatest collection of human knowledge. Our proximity to the capital would offer such scholars the opportunity to make their findings and insights continuously accessible to the world's most important lawmakers. John Kluge's gift also enabled the Library of Congress to award the John W. Kluge Prize for Achievement in the Study of Humanity, a $1 million award which recognizes exceptional scholarly achievement of great impact in the humanities and social sciences, and fills a notable gap in the Nobel Prizes and other major world prizes. The Kluge Prize will be awarded again later this year. Taken together, the prize and the center have supported, showcased, and celebrated more than 600 outstanding scholars from around the world, demonstrating to the world the leadership of America, the Congress, and the Library in sponsoring and developing the human sciences. This evening and tomorrow, we will hear from more than 70 of these top scholars who have at one time or another been residents of the Kluge Center and made substantial use of the library's collection. So in the name of Dr. James Billington, welcome to Scholarfest. I will now transition to my role as moderator of this panel. This is the point in the evening when I asked you to make sure your cell phones are turned off because we are recording this session. As I just said, over the next 2 days, we'll hear from 70 outstanding scholars on a wide array of topics. We will begin tonight with two of our most important returnees, most important guests, Fernando Enrique Cardozo and Romola Thapar. Fernando Enrique Cardozo is a world-renowned sociologist, and the 34th President of Brazil. He received the 2012 Kluge Prize for Achievement in the Study of Humanity. Dr. Ramala Thapar is a preeminent historian of India, and in 2008, a co-recipient of the Kluge Prize along with historian Peter Brown. I'll start with an initial question to each of our distinguished guests. Dr. Thapar, in your lifetime, you've seen the birth of the modern nation of India and its emergence as a global economic superpower, as well as the world's biggest democracy. History, in both its exploration and its manipulation, has played a pivotal role in the formation of national identity and in the foundation of political ideologies. Could you talk about this a bit, how Indian history has been cast and recast since independence, and how understandings of India's ancient and modern histories continue to shape its economic, cultural, and social reality?
I'll make an effort. It's rather a difficult subject. But let me begin by saying that I'm absolutely delighted to be back at the Kluge Center, where I had what I can only describe as a memorable year. And I will explain to you why it became a memorable year, more than most memorable years. But before I go on to talk about that, let me just say that the two things that you mentioned about the emergence of the Indian nation as the world's largest democracy and a global economic superpower. A democracy we are, yeah. And we're very, very proud of it. We're very proud of the fact that since independence, over the last 67 years, we've had more than a dozen elections, and governments have changed through elections. And therefore, we feel very gratified that democracy has taken root in India, and we hope it will continue to function as a democratic society. On the question of being a global superpower, some of us are not too excited about that, but partly because, well, we've seen global superpowers in history and what they've done, and we feel that perhaps we should pause before we leap into that role. And partly also that before you can become a global superpower in the widest and the best sense of the word, you have to make sure that the human condition at home that you're dealing with is a condition that is producing valuable citizens and contentment amongst citizens. And this is a problem which we are still facing in the sense that we have a large population which is either at or below the poverty line. And therefore, I think that there are some questions about how we leap into becoming a global superpower. But let me turn to your major question, which is that of history, and it's a question in which I have been very deeply involved. The question takes one back a little bit to the point of the anti-colonial movement, when history became an extremely important discipline and subject because it was what gave an identity to the Indian nation. Now, let me just also explain in this that one of the reasons why the identity has become complicated, and of course in all post-colonial societies, identities are very complicated. So we're not an exception in that, but we're certainly a society in which there are these complications. The colonial experience that India went through with British colonialism was undoubtedly a major disjuncture in the history of the country. Why do I say that? It was a major disjuncture because the British colonial policy in three areas changed the flow of Indian history and Indian society, culture, economy. The economy was re-geared, the Indian economy was re-geared to support British industrialization. And we all know what the result of that was. It brought in immense poverty of a kind which we had not experienced before. The caste structure of Indian society was reformulated so that colonial policy could use it and colonial administration could understand it. And thirdly, the religions of India were reformulated, as it were, on the pattern of the Judeo-Christian tradition of Europe and to some extent the Islamic tradition of the Middle East, whereas the Indian religious experience, and I suspect possibly also the Chinese religious experience, was of a very different kind. It was of a different kind because I think that we went through a process in which religion was not a firmly determined historical process. Religion in India was a series of sects, and even the formal religions like Islam and Christianity broke up into a series of sects. And the religious experience, religious life, was really a kind of negotiation between sects. And so when we talk about religious tolerance in India, relatively speaking, compared to what we went through in more recent times, we're really talking about the fact that there was a certain amount of decentralization and a certain amount of negotiation between smaller groups who learned to live together in a much more positive way than what we are now trying to do, which is to have these massive religious blocks and constitute laws for the functioning of these very large-scale religious blocks. As far as the casting of history was concerned, so we went from colonial scholarship totally denying that there was any historical tradition in pre-modern India. Indians didn't have a sense of history, they argued. This is a statement which we have since spent 50 years countering, and I think have at last succeeded in countering. But the colonial view was very definite about what it understood of Indian religion. And what did it understand? Two major things. That the territory of India was inhabited by two religious communities, the Hindus and the Muslims. And these two religious communities, which formed nations, how you had nations way back in 3000 BC and 2000 BC, I don't know, but still, they formed two nations that were permanently antagonistic and hostile to each other. So that was one given. And the other given was that the foundations of Indian civilization were based on the Aryan experience of the Vedic culture and the ancient Hindu tradition. And therefore today you have many people in India who are going around claiming that Indians are Aryans, without perhaps fully understanding the extent and nuances that this term Aryan has taken in, certainly from the 20th century. Anyway, these were the two givens of colonial scholarship. And when anti-colonial nationalism became strong, they took some of these ideas and internalized them, and there were others that they rejected. And remember, of course, that in early stages of nationalism, or any stage of nationalism, history is very important. As Eric Hobsbawm has put it, history is to nationalism what the poppy is to the heroin addict. And that is something that has been made very clear in the study of all nationalisms all over the world. So anti-colonial nationalism began by saying, we're all part of the same story, we have a shared history, everybody that lives here and calls himself or herself is an Indian are all part of one history. And it was a very inclusive procedure. It was a very inclusive history in which everybody was given a position and people participated. That was fine for anti-colonial nationalism. It gave us an identity. It gave us such a strong identity that we were able to get rid of the colonial power finally and acquire independence. But because of this insistence that there were two religious communities that were very important, there were two subnationalisms that developed: the Islamic subnationalism and the Hindu subnationalism. The Islamic subnationalism came to fruition in the creation of Pakistan, a new state which became, in effect, a Muslim state. So the Hindu subnationalism today is arguing that if the Muslims have got their state, we in India should also become a Hindu state. Whereas, in effect, we are still living with the ideology of anti-colonial nationalism that argued that India was to be a secular society and a secular polity. And this is part of the reason why historians have run into problems in the recasting of history, because at the public level, the struggle today is between the projection of Indian history in the Indian past as a Hindu past, and other historians who are saying, no, it is a secular projection which has to take in all kinds of people. Now, the reason why this is an important issue is that historically, we have been a country of multiple cultures, multiple religions, any religion under the sun. We will have representatives in India. It has been a culture of plural societies, and we have over the years tried to live together and negotiate, as it were, our relationships that I mentioned earlier. One of the characteristics of the Hindu subnationalism is that there is a belief that the Hindus were victimized by Islamic rule and other rulers that came and ruled, which is a kind of ironic statement, because the real victimization, as in every society in the world, historically and today, the real victimization is of people who are at the bottom level of the social scale. And certainly the Hindus were not at the bottom level of the social scale. So that is another contention that we have with this kind of history. But lest you think that all of Indian history is simply a contention between religious subnationalism and secular nationalism, let me hasten to add that one of the most exciting, intellectually exciting periods of Indian intellectual life, I think, has been the last 50 years, in which we have opened ourselves up to a variety of intellectual ideas, to a variety of ideologies. And as far as the discipline of history is concerned, what has emerged is a very, very powerful intellectual base to the discipline of history, to which many of us have contributed in smaller or bigger ways. This has taken the form, of course, of history moving from being what in colonial times and soon after was called Indology. Now, Indology was a word invented by British colonialism, and it referred to anything to do with India, from butterflies to railways. If you were studying them, you were an Indologist. We've shifted that. We've taken history out of Indology and we've put it into the social sciences. And if there's anything in which I think I can legitimately take pride, is that I did contribute a little bit to this shift to the social sciences. And why do I say it's important? The social sciences and humanities, why is it important? Because it now means that there is a relationship between the discipline of history and every other discipline that goes into the making of these two broad categories. literature, sociology, economics, demography, archaeology, anthropology, you name it. There's a link. So that the historian is today in India beginning to ask a large range of questions that hadn't been asked 50 years earlier. And the main emphasis is not just on collecting information, which is very useful, very necessary, which is a first step, but in asking the major questions of history, which is why and how. Why and how was there historical change? Why did societies and cultures change? How did they change? These are the questions that we are concerned with. We are concerned with the reliability of evidence, and therefore we run into problems who would like with people who would like to put mythology and fantasy in place of history. But we are very concerned about that. We are concerned with critical inquiry, and that is what we are trying to convey through this. And there has been intellectually a tremendously impressive output of Indian historical writing, particularly in the history of the modern period. Those of us who've worked on the pre-modern period have been somewhat besieged by these subnationalisms, but we are learning to slowly get around them, ignore them, forget about them, and carry on with doing the kind of history that is truly meaningful. And in this process of coming to terms with the challenges that we meet as historians, and it's certainly, when I first decided to do history, I thought it would be a nice, comfortable discipline. Ancient history particularly. Who was interested in ancient history? Nobody. So I thought, that's very nice. I'll sit in a little corner and do my own work. It has become politically the most volatile subject in the country today, all over the question of what is the identity of the present day Indian. It is extremely important, but as a result of that, at the intellectual level, it has led to some of the most thrillingly exciting debates of a historical nature that I, at least, have ever experienced.
President Cardozo, in your lifetime, you have seen, and in fact, you have overseen the transformation of Brazil from a nation on the margins of the world stage to one squarely in the center of it. Your pioneering scholarship confronted the legacy of race and slavery in Brazil and exposed myths about why inequality persists. This research set the stage for the Brazilian transformation that you led as president from 1995 to 2003. Could you reflect on how these insights into Brazilian society can help us understand the Brazil that we see and know today? Does the legacy of racial inequalities continue to shape Brazilian national identities?
Well, thank you very much. Let me start by saying some words about Dr. Billington.
Good.
Since he's not present, but I having a very high evaluation. The first time I met Dr. Billington was a long time ago, maybe in the mid of the 70s. Then I was at the Princeton Institute for Advanced Study, and two friends of mine, Albert Hirschman, was a member of the Institute at Princeton and professor at Harvard, and Abe Lowenthal. We decided to create a circle of studies here about democracy in Latin America. Latin America, as you probably know, in the 70s, we are under dictatorship in several countries in Latin America, including in my own country, in Brazil. So we came to the Smithsonian, and Dr. Billington received us, and we created a circle of a group of people to take care of the question of democracy in Latin America. And this has been encouraged by Dr. Billington. So the whole time after that, I came to this place. I was very pleased, as you, to have the opportunity to be here, at the Kluge Center. I left the office in 2003, and I spent some time in Paris. Then I came to this place in order to prepare a book on my experience, not a self-biography, but a book about the government in Brazil. And I spent some time here. That's why I was capable to produce this book. It's a big one, 700 pages, but fortunately only in Portuguese. And this was a very exciting experience. I had contact with other scholars from different parts of the world and with the Kluge Center. And I remember I was trying to recover my capacity as a scholar because I was in power for a long time, 10 years altogether, before the president was finance minister and foreign minister and finance minister. So I had no training in dealing with computers, and I lost one of the chapters of my book here because I pressed a wrong button. But anyhow, it was for me fascinating to have the opportunity to think about what's going on in Brazil. Said that, let me try to respond to your question, but let me elaborate a little bit more about Brazil, since you gave us a wonderful, a brilliant lesson about India. I am not capable to do the same about Brazil. First of all, because my English is poor, and I was not under the colonialism of the British Empire, under the Portuguese Empire, poor Portuguese. Anyhow, as you probably know, Brazil became part of the world, the so-called Western world, because of the Portuguese. And since the beginning, the colony was composed by an enormous amount of land controlled by landlords. This was maybe the main impressive feature of the Brazilian history, is the property of land, big proportion of land and landlords, who were to some extent delegated by the Portuguese Empire. The second important element is the empire, a state. Since the beginning, were under the control of the Portuguese Empire. Well, I'm not going to tell you each year of the Brazilian history, but anyhow, at one point in time, at the 18th century, the point is that Brazil was, in terms of GDP, more important than Portugal. So our sense of colonialism is quite different from yours.
Yes. No.
Because we've never been properly, in that sense, a colony. We have been Portuguese who came to America, like the British who came to America, Portuguese who came to America, and we are under the umbrella of the Portuguese Empire. And the state was very strong in Portugal. And Portugal was very developing in terms of the economy at 16th century, 17th century, and the state was controlled everything in Portugal and in Brazil. So we had land, big landlords, the state, and people. People was almost anyone, slaves, and a group of Portuguese. It took a long time for Brazilians to have the sense that, well, we are not Portuguese. We have, in 19th century, at the beginning of the 18th century, in the beginning of the 19th century, it was already a widespread notion that we have to become independent from Portugal. And who were us in Brazil? Portuguese who came to Brazil and people native to Brazil and a mixed population. Because the Portuguese, since the beginning, have interrelated with the slaves. The slaves were at the beginning the indigenous people, and then came from Africa. But the Portuguese were fighting against Spain all the time. At one point in the 18th century, the then Prime Minister of Portugal, the Viceroy King of Portugal, the Marquis of Pombal, was a very influential man in Portugal. And he sent his brother to be the representative of the crown in the northern part of Brazil, named the province of Grão-Pará, the Amazon area. And there is a very interesting letter from Pombal, the Marquis of Pombal, to his brother, saying like that: you have to encourage the Portuguese living in Brazil to marry with the indigenous women, provide they will have children. Because for us, it's better to have half a Portuguese than one Spanish. So this gives us this sense of how was important for the Portuguese to mix.
Right.
You see? So since the beginning, if you look at the portrait of important Brazilians in 19th century, well, already they were mixed blood. Even if they were, as they were, nobles. Because Brazil, after, at the beginning of the 19th century, because of the French, Napoleon invaded Portugal. So the King of Portugal, under the protection of the King of England, decided to move with the whole crown to Brazil, altogether. The state of Portugal moved to Brazil. This maybe is a unique case.
Yes, yes.
As a colonial power became part of the colony, the so-called colony. And the King of Portugal was living in Brazil for a long time, for years and years and years, almost, I don't know, 15 years or 20 years. So, and, well, then he left, and when he left Brazil, back to Portugal, because of a liberal revolution in Portugal, the new constitution in Portugal forced the king to went back to Portugal. He left his son as his representative in Brazil, delegate in Brazil. And his son became the man who, we used to say this expression, proclaim it. We decide our independence. So our independence, our hero, is the son of the King of Portugal, who became our king. And Brazil became an empire. We had two emperors up to 1888, a long time. And the second one was much more liberal in creating a kind of, let's put like that, noble strata. You see? In fact, it was very simple. It was enough for the emperor to send a letter to a person and to qualify this person as Earl or Marquis or Viscount or something like that. Very cheap for the treasurer, not expensive to appoint anyone. It's enough to say you are a noble. But create a nobility in Brazil in 19th century. This nobility was basically bourgeois, because they were the landlords. Most of them became then noblemen. So Brazil was a very aristocratic society. That is to say, disdaining people in general. And the slavery was there up to the end of 19th century. Up to the end of 19th century. With a difference compared to United States. You have a fight in America to promote the end of slavery. We didn't. In our case, what happened is that the British prohibited the trade of slaves. So the slavery was jeopardized by the British Empire. And in Brazil, we had to solve the problem from labor force. So the Brazilians imported people from Europe, from Italy, from Spain, from Portugal, from Germany, from different parts of Europe. This was at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 19th century. So then Brazil became, 20th century, sorry, 19th century, 20th century. Then Brazil became to be much more, as I can put, a modern society. But still, the landlords were there. Concentration of wealth was very powerful, and this came for all time in Brazil. Well, I'm not going to stay step by step. But you asked me about inequality and the work I did about race, etc. Because of the fact that we are, to a large extent, mixed, the idea was, well, we are a racial democracy. This was the ideology in Brazil in 19th century. Between the 19th and 20th century, the 20th century, between the 19th and 20th century, the wealthy people in Brazil decided to whitewise the Brazilians, to transform Brazilians into whites. So that's why they asked for people to come to Brazil largely, you see. But anyhow, the inequality was there. When the end of slavery occurred, the former slaves become marginal people. This is the first wave of poverty and misery in Brazil. Blacks without being more workers, because they have been replaced by migration in Brazil. So we have an enormous amount of poor people, black people, without any possibility to be integrated into the market. And Brazil was developing because of export. I said in the 18th century our GDP was bigger than Portugal. In the 19th century it continued to grow because of different reasons. In the 19th century as well we started to industrialize, but we had always a massive amount of people out of the system, outcast people, see? Well, and this, I said, in the 20th century we began to speak about racial democracy. That was the ideology in Brazil. Several sociologists and historians wrote about racial democracy in Brazil. Maybe the more important one is a sociologist named Freire, Gilberto Freire, who wrote important books about Brazil and about the Brazilian slavery, so on and so forth. But anyhow, he tried to be lenient vis-a-vis what happened in Brazil. So Brazil was not as bad as other parts with respect to the blacks. When I started to do some research about that, I was under the influence of important teachers in Brazil, one sociologist, one a Frenchman named Roger Bastide, was an expert in black religions, and another one is a Brazilian, Florestan Fernandes. Both have been my teachers. And we did several research because the UNESCO tried to convince the world that the Brazilian model would be the best model for the world, that is to say, racial democracy. And Levi-Strauss, an important anthropologist, wrote a book about the concept of race, and another French named Alfred Metro came to São Paulo and asked us to do a research to prove to the world how good we were. Well, we did several research, including myself. I did several research in the south of Brazil, and the result was exactly the opposite. What is that to say? We had not exactly segregation, but prejudice. The blacks were put apart. It was extremely difficult to have social mobility for blacks, so on and so forth. To give you a very short idea, a story of how was important the influence of this ideology. I have been, it was a long time ago, I was very young, I was in the 20s, 25, something like that, in the 50s, attending a meeting under the auspice of UNESCO in Rio, in the Palace of Itamaraty, which is Foreign Affairs building. And I showed the results of my service in Brazil. And the results were very obvious, the existence of almost racism. Well, the head of the meeting was an ambassador. At the end, called me and said, I was almost to expel you from the room. I said, why? Because we cannot say that to foreigners. Well, that was the situation in Brazil. From that point on, we moved a lot. In other sense, because the transformation of the Brazilian society was very impressive in the 20th century, very, very impressive. I was born in Rio in 1931. That's terrible, but a long time ago. And I moved to Sao Paulo 8 years later on. My father was a military, and he was transferred to Sao Paulo. Well, first time I came to São Paulo, 1940. São Paulo was, well, very beautiful, was a very small city, a European city, with horse on the streets. The streets were not paved. So I was shocked coming from Rio. This was São Paulo. And now if you go to São Paulo, maybe it's bigger than New York. And normal buildings, so on and so forth. All this has been done in 80 years, very impressively, very, very impressively. But inequality was still there. On top of that, I said we had, since the beginning, landlords and also a strong state. Well, step by step, civilian society became more important in Brazil. Workers have been more important, middle class group more important, intellectuals more important. Then we have lots of problems. From time to time, authoritarian regime. The last one started in '64 and lasts up to, I don't know, maybe '88, which is the constitutional day. We create a new constitution, was a member of this assembly. Well, so society started moving ahead. After the redemocratization, well, it was almost impossible not to change. I mean, not to change in terms of the economy, GDP itself. It has been always well. We're not a superpower either, anyhow. But to have economic growth, we're among maybe the 10 biggest economies in the world. But society was very unequal. After the Constitution, because of democracy, people in power have been forced to look after people. It's impossible from now on, from 88 on, not to take care of education, health, access to land, so on and so forth. We did a lot in that sense. Still, if you look, it's a highly unequal society, but the aspiration is toward a more open society, more democratic society. We have been successful in implementing some programs. We refer to some programs in my period we did, but then my successor, President Lula, continued to also to improve. So we have a little bit more, democratic society. But democracy became a value in Brazilian society. So no more state and landlords. We have middle class, we have industry, and we have the aspiration of becoming a decent society. I put an end here. Thank you.
Thank you. As you think about your two countries today, all of the problems that beset them, all of the problems that beset countries all over the world, but concentrating particularly on India and Brazil, what's your greatest fear for India? What's your greatest hope?
Well, I think my greatest fear would be the possible loss of democracy. Not loss, but decline. Because I think that what really keeps us going buoyed up and very hopeful is the fact that the democratic process has taken root. I don't think that it will be affected in the future by whatever happens. But maybe I could put this better if I looked at it in terms of what is it that threatens Indian democracy at the moment. And I would say there are three things. One is what we call vote banks, which is that although technically every person, every adult Indian has a vote and exercises the vote very effectively, there is at the same time an attempt being made to try and build up groups of people on the basis of religion and caste to vote as a single entity. And this really does skew the democratic process. And one of the things that has almost encouraged this is again a legacy from British rule. The British had a census, and they had a census by which they demarcated people according to religion. So the majority of Indians, of course, were Hindus, so the Hindus became the majority community. And then you had a series of minority communities, the Muslims, the Christians, the Sikhs, and so on, the spaces. Now, what is happening is that sometimes you get an effort being made to try and take these communities and organize them into vote banks and get them to vote as a whole. And this is something that we are very anxious to weaken so that the idea of the individual vote still continues. The other thing which is a little threatening from time to time is, of course, what threatens all democracies everywhere in the world, attempts of centralization by the central government, where decisions are taken which should be taken at a much more decentralized level, but which tend to be captured by those in the central government and then used for purposes of really extending their own power and authority. The third problem is, again, coming back to what I was talking about earlier, which I at least feel very strongly about, and that is the need to protect and defend the secularity of Indian society. I think that this is extremely important, and at the moment there have been attempts all along since independence, but these attempts have got a little more noticeable in recent months. There's more talk about banning books and censoring films. There's much more talk about how places of worship where, you know, why do we have to have these, other people have places of worship, why shouldn't we give priority to Hindu temples, that kind of thing. There is also a movement going on which has a certain irony. It's called returning home. And the argument is that initially everybody was, all people were Hindus, and then the Muslims came and some got converted to Islam, and then the Christians came and some got converted to Christianity. So now there's a move to try and reconvert the Muslims and the Christians back to Hinduism. It's not a major move by any means. It's a small group of people who are going around doing this. But it's ironic because Hinduism as a religion does not accept conversion. Yeah. So the reconversion is a bit of a joke. But anyway, there it is. The point is really the mood that goes with this kind of thinking. It's not that it's effective. In fact, they kept offering goodies to people whom they were reconverting. And when the goodies, they reconverted, and when the goodies didn't materialize, they converted back to Islam and Christianity. And why not? I mean, that's a perfectly logical thing to do. But my point is that it creates that kind of awkwardness, and it creates a sort of mood of giving priority to this kind of thinking, which doesn't need priority in a country that is being desperately secular. So that's another thing that I'm concerned with, and particularly because I think that what is happening now is that the program for development is moving away from the program that we had initially after independence, which admittedly was a very romantic program, the upliftment of the poor, the removal of poverty. This was a very major program, which didn't, of course, come off. We didn't succeed in removing poverty altogether. But today there is a tendency for the middle class, particularly in India, to talk much more about development, meaning access to commodities and the whole commodification of the economy to a much greater extent than a concern for the poor. And this, I think, is a problem. Those, I would say, are, and all of this actually ties into a very basic question, which has been much discussed. Recent times, of course, with Thomas Piketty's book, it's been discussed even more, the question of inequality. And this is absolutely fundamental. It's a question that we are all discussing at great length. What do we do with, it's not just the economic removal of poverty, it's not just the culture of equal citizenship, it is a fundamental notion of equality which we have to cultivate. And we don't seem to be cultivating too much. Partly, of course, because political parties are now getting huge donations of money. I mean, the amount of money that was spent in the last election a year ago by every party was absolutely phenomenal. And some of us just gave up and said, well, you know, if this is the way it's going to go, then we may as well not talk about this, the future of this kind of politics. But exactly about 4 months back, there was an election in the Union Territory of Delhi, which is not a state, but it's a Union Territory. And there's a party which was relatively unknown and didn't have too much power, the Aam Aadmi Party, the party of the common man, literally. And it swept the board. It threw out all these very heavily financed rich parties completely. And so people then started saying, oh, now wait a minute, this is giving a new political direction. So that if you can send your people to work in areas and convince people about what they need and tell us what they need, you may be able to build up an alternative politics to the politics of highly financed parties. So that is a little element of hope. The other fear that I have, of course, is, again, a fear that many, many societies all over the world have, gender inequality, which is extremely strong. And we are trying extremely hard. All kinds of promises are made on occasions, on state occasions. We're told that the position of women will be dramatically improved. But in effect, it doesn't happen so easily. We have to keep in mind the fact that we are a highly patriarchal society, have been. And when you have 3,000 years of patriarchy, you can't throw it out overnight. You have to struggle very hard to get rid of it. And the biggest struggle is not that we've got the laws, we've got the courts, we've got people who are also going out and helping every time there is a rape case, there is police action and so on. You have to change the mindset of people, both the men and the women, to recognize the fact that gender equality has to exist, has to come. And that is really the biggest problem in a way to that, changing the mindset. On the question of what is one's greatest hope, one's greatest hope is, my greatest hope for India is, A, that it will continue to remain a plural society, that it will continue to remain a multicultural society, a multi-religious society, as it has been in the past, and the mixture of populations which characterize the Indian population. We have no purity of race, however much we may pretend that some people are racially more pure than others, and there are enough people who hold that opinion. We are a very mixed people, have to be. I mean, all great civilizations are hopelessly mixed, and therefore we should accept that as a reality. So my greatest hope is that that will continue, that will not be broken up, and that there will continue to be a public opinion that is concerned about the reality of the success of multicultural plural societies. That public opinion is extremely important. And in this, I think that a very major part has to be played by the judiciary. And we fortunately, up till now, have a judiciary which does make some pretty good decisions at times. At times they go off by our standards, but most of the time they do make good decisions. And as long as that remains, it's a great support. It's a great support to the whole question of both multiculturalism and inequality. And of course, the greatest advantage we have is that we have a very fine constitution. And there is a tendency when there is a crisis for people to turn around and say, but this is unconstitutional. And that's a help. I mean, you can go against the Constitution. That is also known. But the fact that you can quote the Constitution is something of a help.
President Cardozo, your greatest hope, your greatest fear for Brazil?
Well, you know, a long time ago, President Clinton asked me the same question. He said a different thing. He said, you know, when I approach a nation, I would like to know what is his big fear and what is his hope. Well, in the case of Brazil, there is a phrase in our anthem, national anthem, which says, well, great by nature, we will be sleeping forever in a cradle of I don't remember in Portuguese, splendor, in a cradle of splendor. So this is ambiguous. Great by nature, will keep living forever in a cradle of splendor. Is it good or bad? It's ambivalent, you see? And this is also a doubt. Will be really great? And in our case, our passion has been that, to be developed, to be modern, to be Western, you see? But we are not. We are maybe far Western, but not exactly. So to what extent will be successful in our attempt to become a big nation in that sense? This has been always a fear in Brazil. And from time to time, we are effectively losing the rhythm of history. For instance, for us it was extremely difficult from the 70s to the 80s up to the 90s to understand what was going on in the world because of globalization. To what extent this could be used by Brazil as to be integrated is better or to be apart from. So this has been always a little bit, hesitating what to do, what is good for the nation. So this is a nightmare. And I would say still, there is a kind of division. Some people believe it's better to be in isolation because we are 200 million. So others say, no, it's no more possible. The world is integrated. You have to take into account the new methodologies, new technologies, so on and so forth. So we never know if you really will be one of the big ones. This is not aspiration for the people. The people want education, health, work, this kind of thing. I'm referring to the political elite. The political elite is always doubting what will be our future. Normally, the Brazilians are very, very self-confident. They believe that they will be capable to do whatever will be necessary to become a big nation. But anyhow, this is a fear. The aspiration is to grow, to develop. Now, again, after the Constitution, not because of the Constitution, but because to some extent crystallized this sentiment, it's more usual to look after social questions. So what is the fear? Well, poverty, misery, all questions you refer to, including gender questions. These are the day by day, if you read Brazilian newspapers or people speaking to each other, this is the day by day discussion. To what extent will we be successful in offering education for everyone? To give you an example, in the 90s, looking at the fundamental education for blacks, 25% of the blacks were out of schools. We had no universal access to education. Now we have 97, 98% of access to education. What kind of education? What is the quality of education? The children stay at school maybe 4 hours per day, so it's not enough. So since we are 200 million, always 10% is big. So if you have 10% of good schools, it's good enough to go ahead with the economy. But it's not good enough for people, not good enough for the nation, not good enough for democracy, so on and so forth. So we still are sure that we'll be capable to really create a democracy capable to deliver to people. You refer to democracy. Democracy was a nightmare for us too, the lack of democracy. This has been an obsession during generations in 19th century. Mainly after 1930, we had a period of democracy between 1946 up to 64, and from 64 to 88, again, kind of dictatorship. From that point on, we have elections. But I would say democracy is well entrenched in Brazilians' mindset, not in institutions. We have maybe the architecture of democracy institutionally speaking, but the mindset of people, yes, but the soul of government is not democratic. So the government is still, because we are also, as I said, since the beginning, the government, the administration, the state has been always very powerful. So always there is a risk of someone in power to become populist. That is to say, to address to the people, not in order to do what has to be done properly, but to manipulate the sentiment of the population. So populism. We have always the sense that it will be possible again to have populism. I'm not saying that we have, but it's always possible to have because you have an enormous amount of people with a very medium range of the education. Education is not good enough for all the population. It's possible to manipulate, the state is strong, there is always that. But simultaneously, civil society is very strong. The press has independence in Brazil. And as you said, the judiciary system is also very important. And you have a relatively independent judiciary system. I give an example. As president, I had no possibility to call on the phone the Minister of Justice, a Minister of the Supreme Court, to ask him to vote. No, this is not feasible. They have some, institutional independence. Well, this is true. But you have another question. It's corruption.
Oh, yeah.
As you said before, the political party became a very strange kind of institution. They are day and night looking for money to assure votes or to assure their personal wealth. And corruption is a big problem. And again, judicial system is maybe the main, solution for that. Could be. Yeah? So this is I myself, I fear to some extent the kind of regain of force by populist elements, and also the corruption becoming something which demoralizes the civic life in Brazil. The other side is because of the new technologies. So now we have the informational society, we have the access to everything in terms of the net, the network, and almost people mobilize, people do protest. Everyone wants to have a say in the decision making, but there is no, up to now, possibility yet to have. You have in America also difficulties how to conciliate institutions with the people's will and the capacity of people to react immediately vis-a-vis the new situations. So it's not clear yet what will be our future in that sense. I'm hopeful. I'm not pessimist. Of course, if I read the newspapers today or yesterday or the day before, it will be a disaster because we have corruption, we have the fragmentation in Congress, the lack of leadership, etc. But looking at the society, I'm rather optimistic with respect to the future of the country.
Well, I think this evening has given us a phenomenal launch to Scholarfest. Our two Kluge Prize winners could not have been better conversation partners as we start this celebration of the 15th anniversary of the John Kluge Center. I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking Dr. Thapar and President Cardoso for their remarks this evening.
That is time to say thank you. Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.